together. If we don't get to any of your questions, please feel free to drop those into the either the chat or into a mail directly to myself. My email address, both in the invite, but also we'll share that at the end of the session for anybody that wants to reach out directly to ask any questions. Alistair, if there's nothing else, then we'll jump right into this session.
Yeah, it sounds good.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Okay, so let's start off with, I think, unpacking some of what we know anecdotally around the digital divide. It is something that we are certainly aware of within the sector in which we work. Definitely is an additional layer of the inequality that we see experienced and deepening across the sector. It is something as Africans that is quite familiar because of the nature of inequality, and certainly within the South African context, that's very visible. But currently there are really two indices for measuring this divide, and both expressed as measures of relative poverty. So first and foremost, we have something called internet poverty, which really speaks to the access to the internet and the costs of that access to the internet. And according to the World Data Lab, a person's considered internet poor if he or she cannot afford a minimum quantity, being 1 gigabyte, and quality, being 10 megabits per second, of internet services without spending more than 10% of his or her disposable income on these services. So this minimum package of internet service would then allow a person to, according to them, fulfill their basic needs, such as accessing emails, reading the news, or in particular using government e-services. Interestingly, this is becoming more and more of an issue, both in first and third world context. So as we look at low and middle income countries, as well as the upper income countries, we're seeing that internet poverty and also its sister, digital poverty, starting to manifest more and more across the population, which is a little bit counterintuitive given the penetration that we're seeing in terms of internet access and also the proliferation of devices. But what it does tell us is that those levels of inequality are really deepening across many different contexts. And certainly as we're seeing people choose between internet connectivity and in some cases whether or not to buy bread for the day, we are seeing this as a growing issue as we're moving more and more into the digital economy and the metaverse as we know it. So there are just some stats in terms of the local context and the current position that we find ourselves in. So certainly there is a significant and fairly consistent level of exclusion that we're seeing from a digital divide point of view. This would, of course, mirror the other areas of exclusion and inequality. I just want to pause there. I see a chat. Is there anybody else having issues with the sound? See there, Jacqueline and Andiswa has some issues with the sound. Okay, well, let's forge ahead. I think what I'll do is if there are any issues with the sound, I'm just going to kill the camera from our side for a little bit, and we'll see if that improves. Okay, so yes, so back to the digital divide within the South African context, fairly significant number of internet poor, as we would have it described within the index defined by the World Data guys. Interesting to note, this is almost always deeper within the female populations. So we see that gender inequality also manifesting when we start looking at digital equality. When it comes to the other additional metric of digital poverty, which is perhaps a more suitable measure for the digital divide, as it extends a little bit beyond internet access. Digital poverty refers to really the inability of individuals to fully engage with the online world. And this could be due to a number of different factors, including the access to the internet and access to technology. But there are additional layers to this digital divide that we certainly need to consider when looking at how we bridge the divide. So yes, access is a key part of the digital divide. So if you don't have hardware and you don't have connectivity and you don't have access to the right software, certainly you're not going to be able to use the technology to improve your life or access information. The other layer is that of productivity. So here we're talking about the skills. If we don't have the skills to navigate and use the technology, certainly we're not going to be able to derive benefits from that technology. The third level is that of value. So here we're talking about, are we able to convert our productive capability into value? So do we have opportunities to leverage our productive capability and our access to convert that into value? And this is really speaking about access to things like marketplaces and other opportunities. And generally, these are the three layers that most researchers and most organizations would talk about as they're looking to address the digital divide. For the most part, we're often stuck at the level of access. Increasingly, we're seeing a lot of work done in the productivity layer, which is building skills, but still we're lagging behind when it looks at converting those skills and capability and access into productive value. And when talking about the digital divide, and especially when working with a number of youth organizations, it really is looking at how we move away from simply providing access so that we can waste time on TikTok and Facebook and other nefarious activities online. But one additional area that is not often recognized, and certainly in the research that we've done over the past 3 years, has shown another layer that is certainly increasing and not often being addressed, and that is one of culture. Because technologies and systems are developed largely in developed contexts, so primarily the West, and this would be the US and Europe, or the East, being China and Korea and those kind of countries. What we're seeing is a skewing of representation within this digital environment, or metaverse as it's increasingly called. And this is really both a lost opportunity for us to ensure that there is participation and inclusion of the diversity of cultures that we're seeing globally, but in particular from an African point of view, we don't really have any representation within the metaverse that accurately reflects the range and diversity of cultures and heritage that we have within Africa for sure, but also, globally there are a broad range of different heritages and cultures that should be represented within the digital environment. This is a fairly important one when we start to look at inclusion for young people and also looking at a vision of what the future looks like within a digital world, because for the most part, many African youth don't have a vision of a digitally enabled future, and certainly don't have one that is embedded with their heritage and culture. So certainly there is a lot of work to do in ensuring that we have that inclusion and participation at the cultural level of the digital divide that we're currently seeing. So we know that there's certainly a deep divide within organizations, and often that is not focused on because we're looking at individuals. So from our side, we have been working fairly extensively on the digital divide at an organizational level, and this is one of the reasons for the session today. But certainly we wanted to start discussing how we can bridge that digital divide, both at a beneficiary client level, as well as at an organizational level. So in bridging the digital divide, we want to consider two different areas. Firstly, as an organization, how are we able to bridge the digital divide within our organization, because it is certainly manifesting as much as it is within the individual level, where we have beneficiaries that are excluded from the digital world, and how are we able to strengthen our organization so that we can better deliver services using technology and also enable the clients and beneficiaries that we're working with. I think the starting point is really to remember there are no silver bullets. So often we look to technology as something that can solve all of our problems and make things a lot easier for us. But unfortunately, this is often not the case. There is no field of dreams. When we're bringing in new technology, we're building technology, we're buying technology, there's often the approach that if we build it, it'll be used, or if we build it, they will come. This is definitely not the case. So there's a lot of work that has to go into driving users, driving adoption, managing change in order for us to get the best value out of any technology that we're using. Then open source and not-for-profit discounts. This is a favorite topic for me because we see it quite often working with a range of partners. There is a misconception that there are free lunches. So the saying "free like a puppy" is a fairly good one to use in this context, because nothing is really ever free. If you get something for free, it's going to cost you somewhere, either in terms of costs later on, or in terms of hosting, or in terms of maintenance, or in terms of additions. There are no such thing as a free lunch within the technology realm. So it's going to cost at some point or other. Far better to know what that cost is going to be at the outset. Open source technology is just a reference to the manner in which something is built. Again, it doesn't mean that it's free. There's always going to be some cost associated with an open source solution. So we will dig into some of that as we get to the different options from a tooling point of view. But important to remember, when somebody's talking about open source or talking about not-for-profit discounts, nothing is ever free. It's just a matter of when it's going to cost you, and at that point, how much. One of my bugbears with open source technology and not-for-profit discounts is that often those costs, because they are not immediately apparent, can cripple an organization, and it prevents them from allowing a budgeting cycle to prepare and manage that, because they're often introduced later on and without any warning. So it's something to consider when looking at a range of solutions. And then just finally, in terms of some key things to remember, technology is long-term relationships. So no one-night stands here. If you're going to get involved with a technology solution, inevitably it's a long-term relationship, and is going to involve a fair amount of investment, and both in terms of time and money, and some level of commitment by both parties that are involved in that relationship. So when we're looking at the digital divide, some considerations in how we bridge that divide. Firstly, to remember that connectivity, of course, is always going to be a concern. So the solutions that we're looking at should allow us to manage through low bandwidth or limited connectivity. Look at where we can leverage things like content distribution networks. So that means localizing content so that it is more accessible in particular areas where we're not having to go overseas to fetch the data. Then also to think about things like reverse billing and zero rating. Now, this is an area that is currently being worked on by a number of organizations, certainly in South Africa, where the networks are obliged with their licensing to offer free internet services from an access point of view to public benefit organizations. Unfortunately, they've been extremely slow in honoring these obligations, and there are organizations currently lobbying government for this to change so that civil society organizations will be able to make their content freely available to both beneficiaries and clients. While that's happening, and it's likely to be a fairly long and drawn-out process because the networks are enjoying some fairly significant revenues from it, there are services like reverse billing. So reverse billing allows you as the organization to pick up the tab for somebody to access your content. And we certainly saw this over the course of COVID, where organizations were needing to put out information and to migrate to hybrid working or fully remote working environments where they needed to make content available at no cost to the user. So that cost is then passed on directly to the organization. So there are reverse billing structures that allow that to happen. Currently, there are very few of those services are available. They do offer some level of not-for-profit discount, but it can be a costly undertaking, especially as you bring video into the equation. Then moving on to the hardware considerations. So hardware is fairly prolific at this stage. We know that mobile phone penetration is well over 100% at this stage. Most people have multiple phones and have cycled through many phones over the course of their contracts. So the penetration of hardware is not necessarily the issue, but as we're looking to deploy solutions, we need to ensure that the hardware we're using is fit for purpose. And also we have a good view of the total cost of ownership. So that total cost of ownership, we're talking about the cost of maintaining, the cost of securing, and the cost of servicing any of that equipment, and then also potentially the cost of replacing that equipment. So we do need to consider the hardware for the solution that we're implementing to ensure that we do get the maximum traction for the technology solution that's being deployed. Software, we'll come dig into this in the next slide, but there is an entire discipline that has been focused on what drives the usage of software. And primarily here, we're looking at things like the ease of use. So how easy is it for us to use it? And then also, how useful is it? And we talk about perceived usefulness here because we have different perceptions around whether or not something is useful. So perceived usefulness is an important focus for driving the adoption and use of technology. And then linked to that is what we call warmware. So the warmware layer is probably the most neglected consideration when it comes to implementing solutions. And for us, we've seen consistently that this is often what leads to the failure of any technology project, is an inadequate allowance and focus on the people that are required to drive the technology, to build awareness about the technology, to provide the training and support, and to champion its adoption. So the warmware layer is a really important consideration when you're looking at how to bridge that digital divide, either as an organization internally to adopt and use a new piece of tooling, or to drive a piece of technology into a base of clients or beneficiaries. So the warmware layer, a really important consideration. And the warmware layer, their job is really to focus on driving adoption. And as I said, there is an entire discipline dedicated to technology acceptance and adoption. So this is an example of one framework that provides a model for mapping out what drives adoption and use of a technology. You'll see on the right-hand side, ultimately, it all comes down to, again, perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use. But what these academics have done is, through research, have unpacked what are the factors that contribute towards that perceived usefulness and ease of use. Ultimately, all of these factors should convert into the behavioral intention, the behavioral intention being, yes, I want to use this thing, which is the precursor to then actually use it. And the reason that this is often broken down is because, as we know, the best intentions don't necessarily convert into action. But this gives us a view of some of the complexity behind user adoption and usage of a particular piece of technology. So it is really important that we're considering what are the factors that will drive my base of users, whether they be internal from an organizational point of view or external in terms of a base of beneficiaries or clients. So this is also where we would see the role of background and culture, our exposure and experience in dealing with the digital environment. Obviously is going to have a negative effect when it comes to both perceived usefulness and the ease of use. So these are the sort of things that we need to consider when embarking on a journey of bridging that digital divide. So I'm going to pause there just to see if there are any questions at this stage. We are steaming through quite a lot of content at the moment, so I want to make sure that no one's getting left behind at this stage. Let's see if we can turn that camera on again. So yeah, if there's any questions at this stage, please feel free to jump on, drop it in the chat or in the Q&A section, and happy to try and answer those questions. I will share the presentation and also the recording, and also my email address. So, Chandra, there's the technology acceptance models. There are 4 or 5 iterations of it, going back to the 70s and 80s. So it has been around for quite some time. There are a range of academic papers. Certainly happy to share those with you if you'd like to dig into some of those model fundamentals. It is some of the base of what we used in doing our research on the digital divide and how it manifests at an organizational level. But it has been around for quite some time in looking to unpack what are the factors that drive technology adoption and use. Obviously, there is a fairly significant commercial driver in this day and age for understanding what makes users adopt and use a piece of technology, both in terms of the corporate or commercial environment, but also in terms of broader technology use within the public. So hope that answers the question. Great. Okay, so let's then jump into some of the basics around systems. Certainly, Darren, I'll if you drop me a mail, then I'm happy to share those with you. So from a system basics point of view, there are, of course, multiple components that go into a system that we have to have in place for it to be able to work. And here we're talking about, yes, hardware, software, the network communications, which is the connectivity, but also the server infrastructure and the connection of that server infrastructure, the data that we're managing through systems, as well as we've been talking about now, the people and also the processes. So the considerations from a system point of view when it comes to hardware, these are the user devices. So this is the desktops, the mobile devices, handsets, tablet devices, the things that the user is using to interact with, but also the servers. So the servers are the devices that are managing and running the applications that we're running. For the most part, these are mostly cloud-based nowadays, although you will still have some localized servers with bigger systems sitting on site that house applications and store data that is being used by the system that you're operating. So these are important considerations as you start to look at a particular system function, or whether it be assembled or built or taken off of the shelf, because there are considerations around accessibility and also the cost. So in looking at a system, we need to consider the hardware component as we're planning for a particular deployment. Then the software, here especially where we're talking about custom development, we may talk about a technology stack or a tech stack. The tech stack being the back end, so where all the processing happens on the servers, the front end, which is the things that we interact with as users of a particular system, as well as the infrastructure. So the infrastructure would typically be a cloud service like Azure or AWS or Google Cloud or DigitalOcean, a cloud provider that is responsible for hosting the servers and the applications that you're running. Also important to consider things like the operating system, and here we're talking more about the user devices. So on a user device, you may have an Android application or an Apple application with iOS, or you may have Windows or a desktop application. Just important to note, and we'll touch on this a bit later, you may then also need to consider where those applications are being housed. Sorry, I see we're slowing down there with the video. There we go. Let's turn that off again. So yeah, so as I was saying, within the mobile application environment, mostly we're looking at Android and iOS. Important to note, within Android deployments, there are different marketplaces. So yes, we may all know about the Google Play Store, but there is also a Huawei store that is a separate entity from the other Google Play Store. So when you're deploying applications, you may need to host on both Play stores. And then some other device considerations, whether or not you're building a progressive web application, a native application, which is something that's installed on your device, a web application, which is hosted and accessed through a browser, and then also a desktop application, which may be something that you install directly onto your computer. The network communications, yes, we're talking about connectivity here. How do I access the application? Do I need to have mobile data? Do I need to have connectivity? Are there any system integrations? So do I need to connect to other servers and other applications in order to access their data? And how am I going to do that? Are there any APIs? So application programming interfaces are ways for computers or for systems to connect with each other and to communicate without necessarily having to present an interface. So this, for example, is where we're doing a query into Home Affairs from our system. We would want to do a lookup on an ID number using an API to get a reply to say, yes, this individual is registered with Home Affairs and here are their details. So those are some considerations. For the most part, we would be focused primarily just on the connectivity requirements, but important to consider that there may be other system integrations and APIs that the system is using to query third-party systems and infrastructure. Then we have the data. So the data is a bit like the currency that moves through the system. And the architecture of the data describes how the data is managed from the point of collection through to transformation and use, and then how it's distributed again. So it really sets the blueprint for the data and the way that it flows through the system. So the architecture shows us how the data is moving from the user through the system into storage or back to the user, and what is the structure of that data flow. Within that, we then have database relationships. So the database being what we use to store the data. So we would want to know what is the relationship between the data that we're storing. And as we're looking at the database, what kind of database are we going to be using that would best suit our data architecture? And again, there are a number of considerations that we would look at when it comes to things like a database structure. And for the most part, you wouldn't need to worry about those because that would sit with your developing partner. But these are things that would come up in conversation and would need to be considered when building systems. And certainly as you're looking at bigger enterprise systems, those database selection questions become more and more important, the more data that you're managing. And also the volume and the range of transaction within that data would also play a role in determining what database you're using. I think really important as always when it comes to data, the database and the system is only as good as the data that it's processing. So if you put rubbish into it, you're going to get rubbish out of it, no matter how good the database is, no matter how good the architecture is, and how well the database relationships are mapped. If you put rubbish into a database, you're going to get rubbish out for sure. The people we've spoken somewhat about, and certainly there are two categories of people that we would need to consider. Firstly, the users, and secondly, the warmware or our support layer. The users, when we're looking at the way that they're interacting with the system, we do need to understand their context. We need to understand their personas. Now, their personas are really how we're categorizing how they would interact with the system. What do they want from the system? How are they going to use the system? Where are they using the system? What is the result that they're looking to achieve? And understanding users and their context is really important when it comes to driving things like adoption and usage. So we want to make sure that we understand the users as best we possibly can. And ideally, we should build from the user up. So building from the ground up, basing the system design on the user needs rather than pushing down from the way that we think the user will engage with the system. And when looking at designing any systems, there is an entire field of design around that human-centered design, specifically from a technology point of view, putting the user at the center of anything that we're building and ensuring that we're able to deliver that usefulness that they're looking for, and also that we're delivering an easy experience. Really sophisticated, mature technology reaches maturity when it becomes almost invisible, when the user barely knows that it's there because it's so simple and so intuitive to use. And for the most part, that's only achieved if you're designing with the user at the center of any system that you're building. And then, of course, supporting that user with a warmware layer that helps them to access and manage and resolve issues related to the system as quickly and as simply as possible. So the warmware layer works as the bridging point between the user and the system, and really is, as I said, an essential part of any implementation where we're looking to use technology in particular to bridge that digital divide. And then as we're looking at what are we going to do with the system once it's complete? So once the system has been deployed, how are we going to manage it? So the institutional knowledge that is required really is based on a clear definition of processes. So how are we using the system? How are we going to onboard users? How are we going to manage their journey onto the system? How are we defining what is acceptable use of the system? In particular, we'll see this within the context of the internal systems that are being used. There may be policy that would link to acceptable use. Acceptable use may also come from network providers, for example, where they have stipulations around what you can use the system for. But also importantly, we want to make sure that we can maintain that warmware layer that is both driving adoption and awareness about the system, but is also ensuring that there is consistent and easy access to support as users are encountering problems. So there are always problems with system adoption. There are always challenges, there are always bugs. And without that warmware layer, those frustrations can either drive the circumvention of any processes, or they'll drive frustration and ultimately the drop-off of users. So the warmware layer, again, essential to ensure that we can maintain consistent adoption and usage of any given system. And we need, in order to support that warmware layer, we need to have a clear process defining how do I access support? Am I logging tickets? Do I pick up the phone? Do I send an email? What are the points of escalation if I don't have a resolution of the problem? How am I interacting with my technology partners if there is an issue that can't be resolved by my warmware layer? So those support structures need to be institutionalized within the organization to ensure that there is consistent usage, but also that any issues can be resolved fairly quickly. And certainly, as we said, the policies in place to manage acceptable use of any given system. And we'll pick up on the policy discussion as we get to the governance side, because there are a range of considerations from a policy point of view to ensure that the system remains accessible, but also is being used as it was intended. So I'm going to pause then again, just to see if there are any questions around the system structure. Again, we're just talking about the processes to manage systems. We're talking about the people that are required for those systems. What is the structure of the data that we're storing and creating within that system? The communications in order for us to access that system and other systems. And then the software components that are delivering a service to us and managing our data. And then, of course, the hardware that is required in order for us to run the software. So all of these elements are really essential parts of a holistic system that is deployed within your organization or to a base of beneficiaries and clients. And we need to consider each of these different elements if we're going to deliver a service using technology that can enhance and improve the work that we're doing, certainly within the development sector. Okay, so just to check if there are any questions, comments. For the most part, I'm just making the stuff up as I go along. So feel free to jump in and shout out any questions. If you have any, raise your hand. I'm happy to have a conversation about any of the points as we're going. No questions? That's fantastic. I'm just making stuff up as I go along. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just pause for a second and just let everyone just have a 5-minute break. Generally, we want to also provide an opportunity for some more questions if there are any, but certainly we're going to dig in the next piece of the session more into the actual systems, in particular some of the tools and technologies that we can access to support the work that we're doing within the development sector. Sure, Renal, did you have a particular question on that? Renal was just asking if you can go to the data again. So yeah, so as I said, Renal, the data architecture is how the data is managed. The database relationship is the association between the various tables or the data structures that are created. And that determination of a database really depending on the nature of the application. So lots of different databases that we can use, SQL databases like Oracle and PostgreSQL for structured data, NoSQL databases for unstructured or semi-structured data, and a range of different cloud-based options that provide a lot of managed function and also scalability. But yeah, as I said, the data only as good as the well, the database only as good as the data that we're putting in. Okay, so let's just pause there for a second and just take a 5-minute comfort break, so that I can make sure that I'm not putting anyone to sleep, well, at least into a mild daze. And we'll start to dig into some of the more interesting stuff around the tools and the technologies that are available for us to use. We want to look at really how we can apply and access those technologies to firstly improve our operational structures as an organization. And for the most part, that's where technology has been focused, as we're quite familiar with things like HR and payroll, and even monitoring and evaluation to some extent. But there are a lot of options, increasingly things that can support learning outcomes, that can help to access marketplaces. There are a range of really great tools that are fairly accessible, and some of them at a relatively low cost. Yeah, just a question about the processes. So the processes here, we're looking at putting in institutional structures that support the technology that we're using. So again, how are we onboarding users, how are we training users, how we're communicating to users about the system, setting up users on the system, and determining how they can and can't use the system, and then also how they're accessing support when they're using the system. So again, coming back to that warmware layer, and also how all of that is governed. So as I said, I will share this presentation, so all of this content will be available after the session, and we'll also then share the recording, so you can also access it there. And again, if you do want any of the papers on the technology adoption models, there are a range of other materials about the digital divide. Certainly, I think you would be seeing that more and more within the development sector, how technology and access to technology is increasingly a critical human right. And there are a lot of initiatives that are driving that function of accessing and being able to use technology as a core human right. So it is important to consider the options for driving that access and use. I think when we did our research about 3 years ago in working with different organizations and understanding how the digital divide manifests within organizations, the irony is that many organizations are driving digital inclusion and access to technology, but unfortunately, many of them don't have the same institutional capacity as an organization. So you have this disconnect in organizations that are trying to drive digital inclusion and access, but as an organization, they don't have the internal capacity, they don't have the resources, and they don't have the experience to navigate technology as an organization. So it makes it then really difficult to drive digital inclusion within a base of beneficiaries or clients when you yourselves don't have that internal capacity. So it just slows down the process of driving digital inclusion. Unfortunately, it does also lead to a lot of replication, duplication, and wastage. So with organizations that are trying to bridge that digital divide, trying to access tools, trying to enter into that digital economy, because there is limited capacity and resources, often what that translates into is firstly, not getting what you think you're going to get. So you're paying a lot of money to get a piece of technology that not really fit for purpose, perhaps not exactly what you thought you were going to be getting, and ultimately not something that you can, as an organization, maintain or even actively drive once you've got it. So again, coming back to that field of dreams analogy, no technology is like a field of dreams. So if you build it, or if you buy it, or if you hire it, and expect users to simply use it because it's there, it never happens. And because there are always these ongoing costs associated with an organization, with a system, inevitably what happens is we would see some fairly rapid adoption and use, if you're lucky. That would then plateau out. So that would flatten out, and then you'd start to see a gradual decline in terms of usage of that particular system. And ultimately, what ends up happening is those systems get orphaned. So you have lots of technologies that receive lots of investment, are used for a little bit, and then die because of the ongoing cost, because of the ongoing resources and time that's needed to maintain and keep those systems alive. So currently within the development sector, there are fairly sporadic efforts to use technology. They're done in silos because as a sector, we're really, really good at talking about collaboration. We're pretty rubbish at actually doing it. So moving beyond that function of pseudo collaboration is really an important focus, and technology can help us to better integrate the work that we're doing. But certainly as a starting point, we need to see what technologies are already available. And this is, again, the reason for sessions like this and why we want to look at some of the tools and platforms that already exist. But certainly in our experience, there's something that's already been built. For the most part, even though we're working in different sectors, be it education or health or any of the other areas, there's a fairly good chance that somebody has built something before. Because we're not good at collaborating, we're unlikely to know about it. So we would spend the same money on getting another system that does exactly the same thing and go through the same trials and tribulations of building a system or acquiring a system. And then eventually we would see those systems die out again. So really, there's a fairly urgent need to drive this sharing of knowledge, sharing of tools and technologies so that we can get greater use out of them. But also more collectively, we can build systems that serve the needs of the beneficiaries and our organization better. So there is more and more technology available, and certainly as we see the more advanced technologies coming out, there is a lot that technology can add to the work that we do within the development context. But we shouldn't be spending money that's already been spent. We want to leverage the work that has already been done in the past so that we're adding and accumulating value rather than starting from the beginning again. certainly as we're looking, and we'll discuss this as we get to the building of technology. Technology is a difficult undertaking, and that's coming from somebody who is a technologist at heart. It's not an easy journey, and even when you're buying something that's off the shelf, it's tough. So ideally, we want to leverage the lessons from other organizations, from other partners as best we can, and try to learn from those experiences and get more value out of the technologies that we're deploying. Okay. Yeah, thanks for that, Chandra. Just shout if you do have a question. If anybody wants to make a comment or ask anything, just let me know, raise your hand, and we can then have a conversation. At this point, I'm just speaking to a few circles on the screen, and I have the pleasure of looking at my own face, which is never a good thing. Let's just find you there. Thanks, Chandra. Let's just find you in the lists of participants. Sorry, it's a bit slow. Here you are. So I'm just trying to find you to unmute you. Okay. So I see you dropped your hand there, Chandra. Yes, I'm not sucking it out entirely out of my thumb. Thanks, Ronel. It is some hard lessons that we have learned and we're still learning. So yeah, it is a hard-earned experience. Adrian, just checking on your question. Is that in the Q&A? Let me just see that. Yeah, so Adrian's just asked whether or not the use of technology is a human right. So the confusion around things like TikTok and WhatsApp. Should the message not be access to information and technical productivity systems? Yeah, I think to some extent, but I think fundamentally the right to choose is an important part of that. So whether or not the accessibility is for productive use, again, I think there are functions of control there that we need to consider, and how much how many constraints are in place in terms of defining what that access should mean. So I think broadly, we also want to have the choice to select how we engage with those technologies. So I think this is why it has been defined more broadly in terms of that access. But certainly from our side, as we look at the digital divide and we talk about those different levels of, yes, access is important, but also we want that access to be focused on productive capability, and then also converting that productive capability into value, while also ensuring that there is effective representation within that digital world that we're now living, so that we're not just subsumed into this kind of gray mass of users, where the experience is defined and dictated by either the West or the East. So that's certainly that dilution of culture and heritage is very apparent. As you start to look at different systems, you'll see that systems are very similar, very standard in the way that they approach, and there's good reason for that in terms of ease of use. But there is definitely opportunity for us to represent more of the diversity that we have within our collective global base of users, in a way that's not defined by somebody in Silicon Valley in the US or somebody in Beijing in China. So we definitely want to see how we can provide better inclusion and representation within this digital environment that we're living. And when we did, as a matter of interest, when we did the research in particular in working with young people and their access and use of technologies, it was quite sobering to see that there are very few modern references for an enabled digital Africa. So in terms of specific cultural references, just generally when somebody says Africa, we're talking about wild animals, and we're talking about mud huts or squatter camps. And that coming from also the young people from Africa that we're dealing with when they're asked to search for images. These are the images that they're finding. And in terms of a modern digital representation of an Africa of the future, there really is only one that came out consistently, and that was the movie Black Panther. So that's really the first and currently the only modern digital reference for an Africa of the future that is digitally or technology enabled. So I think there's certainly a lot of work that we need to do in driving that that inclusion and representation within the digital world. Okay. Isaiah is asking, how do we encourage collaboration and inclusion amongst organizations to eliminate current duplication? Isaiah, it's a very difficult one. As I said, as a collective, the social economy is especially good at talking about collaboration. We talk a great game when it comes to collaboration. And even where we have forums, we have communities of practice, we have community meetings, everyone talks a good game. Unfortunately, that seldom translates into actual integration and collaboration. And part of the reason for that is because of the massively competitive nature of the work that we do, because there is limited funding and we're all competing for the same limited pool of funding. So sharing things like technology, which as an organization you might have invested in, and perhaps see as some level of competitive advantage, there's a lot of reluctance to share that with other organizations. When it comes to tooling, also the development of systems is usually done in isolation. So it's built for a single organization rather than a multi-tenant platform that can be used by multiple organizations. And that sort of multi-tenant architecture allows you to separate user data, separate organizational data, so that you can manage multiple instances. Unfortunately, as I said, most systems are not built in that way. We built a few systems like that, definitely with UNICEF. So with UNICEF and PwC, we built a multi-tenant platform called Yomobi. So Yomobi is a suite of digital tools for youth organizations and includes things like micro learner management system, chat rooms, digital wallets, digital tasks, community service, content channels. So there's a whole suite of tools that can be used by the organization however they like. And that for us is the approach, in all of the technology that we build is looking at multi-tenancy options. So don't worry, the slides haven't started yet, Johan. I'm just responding to the questions and talking through some of our experience. So yeah, so in terms of driving that collaboration and integration, certainly building with collaboration in mind and looking at how to share is a good starting point, so that there is less duplication. More broadly, I think engaging in communities of practice and making those systems available, I think is also a good starting point for driving more integration and less duplication of effort. Again, because these are not new issues that we're dealing with, the sorts of systems that are meeting these issues are likely to be fairly consistent, regardless of where we're working. If we're working in education, similar issues. We may need to contextualize or localize, but a lot of the functionality is going to be exactly the same. And on that note, so that Johan knows he's not frozen, we're going to move on to some of those digital tools and just discuss some of the functionality that we can unlock with some of those tools. And for us, we look at this as across really three categories. So in terms of organizational maturity, we would see there being three steps. Firstly, the function of migration, then transformation, and ultimately evolution. There may be some kind of jumping through these different steps, but for the most part, we would see organizations that would start with the function of migration. So how do I move into digital? I've got paper-based processes. I've got hundreds and thousands of forms that I have to keep for 5 to 7 years, depending on the work that I'm doing. So how do I start that process? And generally, that's a function of migration. And then we get onto the digital transformation, and this is where we're starting to use technology actively in the programs and the operations that we're running. And this is starting with digitization at the point of contact rather than moving from paper or hard copy as the starting point. And then finally, the evolution, and this is where we're looking at self-generated data. So data that is being generated by the system itself, where the systems are starting to operate and manage themselves, whether that be a function of AI or things like blockchain and smart contracting. Again, it's looking at an evolution of the way that data is created and managed. So starting with migration, hard copy data, transformation into digital captured data, and then evolution into self-generating data. So again, the data being the currency across any of these system functions. So let's have a quick look at the migration. So digitalization of documents, there are a number of solutions that can help you to digitize this data. So systems that are responsible for capturing data or converting hard copy data. The paper processes, certainly everyone's got files and boxes of paper. The starting point is obviously scanning, so capturing that into a digital format. There are systems that will help you to extract data from those scanned images. So through a function of OCR or character recognition, the data can be extracted from a scanned document and then captured into a digital format. The importance of that being that you can then edit and manage that digital data rather than working just with an image. So that digitization function is often the starting point where you've got a lot of historical or legacy data to be able to take that data on and manage it more effectively through a system. Once that data has been digitized, and again, on that, there are a few companies that specialize. There's a local company called Bunye, and they have a suite of services that they offer. And Microsoft has a range of offerings as well as AWS. So there are a few options when it comes to document digitization. Document storage is probably something that we're all quite familiar with. Certainly as an organization, everyone's likely to have something like Google Drive or OneDrive or Dropbox or something similar. This is, I think, going to be a bit problematic going forward, and because of the likes of Papier and just where that data is stored within most cloud offerings, we don't know where that data is. Most organizations or most cloud providers will distribute that data depending on available storage and also proximity from the point of entry. So your data may be sitting in London, maybe sitting in Germany, or maybe sitting in Seattle, which is all good and well because you may not even know it. But when it comes to things like Papier, the physical location of that data is important. And in terms of the legislation, unless you have a dispensation for storing that personal information and you've also got consent, then you're in breach of the legislation, in breach of the Act itself, and then potentially liable for fines and other such things. So where that data is stored, I think, is going to be increasingly important. From our side, we've looked at a few different storage solutions. So we have a document storage and management platform that we run locally, and that gives us our own server. So we store our data much like you would Google Cloud, where we can distribute it across the organization, but you can specify where you want the data to be stored, and you can set up your own server to run it. That platform is what we use called Nextcloud. There are a range of different functions that are included within that, things like calendar setups and tasks and project management. There is a whole suite of tools that come prepackaged in much the same way as Google has a range of different options with their Google Drive. But we've opted for the Nextcloud option because of ease of deployment and also being able to specify where it's located, and then the additional functionality that we have from a document management point of view. So that document management, speaking to managing permissions, managing distribution, managing any kind of processing on top of that documentation. So again, as is the case with all of these tools, Google is your friend. If you choose not to use Google, Yahoo is still around. And of course, Microsoft has their own search engine. Go to search engines and look around. There are a lot of options for things like document digitization, storage, and management. So best to find one that works best for you. Okay, so this is probably the busiest slide that we've got. Just a question there from an unknown user. Adrian, sorry, I did miss your question there. For system replacements, donations of old equipment. Adrian, there are some organizations that try to use that legacy equipment, which is great. They do try to coordinate it. It's hard work, to be perfectly honest. Hardware in particular, you're not entirely sure what you're getting. And I think one of the challenges when it comes to donated hardware, sorry, everyone, I'm just referring to the question in the chat. Donated hardware can, again, there are no free lunches. So even when you get something for free, it's going to cost you. So you're going to have to look and see what system you've got. You're going to have to clean the data. You're going to have to check the integrity of the hardware itself to make sure that you don't deploy it and then it explodes. So there are a lot of considerations around that donated equipment, I think in much the same way as you look at even food. So the work that the food bank is trying to does, for example, is a good example of that coordinated effort. But we still see massive wastage of food that's expiring or going to be expiring that can't be harnessed, can't be used. And I think to some extent technology is a bit like that, increasingly because it is quite consumable. So it's not designed to last forever. So we have this unfortunate culture of replace as opposed to reuse. And often those components are very difficult to repair. So it does mean that you have to throw that stuff away. And so of course, we've got then major recycling and wastage issues. But certainly, ideally, it would be great if we could get that equipment into the hands of people that don't have anything. And then just another question, how do they digitize their documents? It can be a very expensive process. Again, start simple with what you've got. So we've, in the past, in terms of digitization in the field, we've used mobile phone, then mobile applications that will allow you to convert an image into a PDF. So if you have to digitize and you don't have anything else, use a camera phone, convert into PDF, and then run into some function of document management. Again, the quality of that photo is not going to be great, but if it's the only option that you have, you do the best you can with what you've got. And certainly the improvements in mobile phones and camera technology means that there's a lot more flexibility and quality in the image capturing. You can even do things like extract data from an image on your phone. So for example, if you take a picture of a table on your phone, you can extract that data directly into a spreadsheet. So you can store the image and then you can extract that and open it with Excel simply from an image. So those some of the things that you can achieve with relatively little cost and stuff that's already there and it's not going to cost you anything. So again, we do the best you can with what you've got. Google is always your friend, or Bing is always your friend when it comes to trying to solve problems. Go to the search engine. Somebody's had that question before, pretty much guaranteed. It's just a matter of refining your search to find the best solution based on your current context. Okay, so then just to jump into the transformation category of digital tooling for the shelf. I just want to pause, see if there are any other questions just around migration before we jump into this section. Nope. Okay. So this is the fun stuff. These are all of the toys and tools that that we can access. We've used a lot of different tools over the course of the last 25 years. The most prolific one is certainly digital data collection, and certainly as we're looking at monitoring and evaluation, one of the best ways to streamline your M&E process is to get data onto a system as soon as possible. There are a bunch of paid for services for digital data collection. Important to watch out here for the free ones that have kind of limited usage for free, and then as soon as you hit that usage cap, the pricing jumps up. So, for example, platforms like Comcare and Magpie and even Textit have free offerings. So you can collect so many submissions, you can manage so many field workers before you then reach a cap, and there you're going to have to start paying on a monthly basis per user. So those costs jump fairly significantly. Unfortunately, most of these platforms run on a dollar base. So we're paying, certainly in South Africa, we're paying almost 20 to 1. So it does make those solutions fairly expensive. There are things like Cover Toolbox or Cover Collect, which are free tools that you can either run for free off of their service, or you can deploy your own instance. Unfortunately, most of the functionality is it can be quite difficult to navigate. So being able to set it up without any support is tricky. So it will cost you, again, no free lunches. It will cost you from the setup and the support and a training point of view to get to grips with the tool, even though the tool itself is free. So there are a range of those kind of mobile application tools that are available pretty much off the shelf. UNICEF's done a range of projects with pretty much all of those. There's Honor as well, in addition to the Cover Toolbox and things like computer forms. There are also options when it comes to digital forms, web-based forms. So web-based forms through the likes of Microsoft and even Google Forms provide a really accessible and low-cost option. So you can create forms online and then deploy those to either a web application or even onto a mobile device. So if you're looking at low-cost options, those web form functions, definitely a good place to start. We've used things like WordPress plugins extensively. So there are a lot of WordPress plugins that will give you fairly advanced form functionality with conditional logic, with uploading images, with stop and start functionality. So there's a lot of capability that you can find for web-based data collection and forms simply by using free or relatively cheap plugins off of the likes of WordPress, which is a content management system. So again, important to have a look at what is available within the budget that you have available, and also within the internal capacity that you have to navigate those tools. Once we've got that data, we've captured it, data management, most tools will come with some function of database. So if you're managing off of that database, then you don't have to worry too much, but you may have a need for an independent database where you're capturing data. So an alternative to the digitization of your forms is you may take the hard copy documentation and then capture that into a database so that you can access the records more easily. The challenges, of course, when it comes to that secondary capture are the usual runs around quality and quality assurance. So it is important to make sure that you're verifying that on an ongoing basis. You have QA structures, that warmware layer in place when you're digitizing into things like a database and a bunch of database management functions that you can use even within the Microsoft suites and Microsoft Access. But generally, there's a few dozen different database options. Again, go to Google and check what is available for you to access. And again, within the constraints of what you can afford and also the amount of data that you're going to be managing. Usually the amount of data that you're going to be managing will determine how much you're going to have to spend on a database. And important to remember that if you need to migrate, the cost of migration can be relatively high into a new database. So you need to extract data, you need to reprocess it, and then embed it or import it into a new database. Bram, yeah, so in terms of, so Bram was just asking recommendations on data collection software for field workers. Again, I think it depends on what it is that you're going to be collecting, what is the budget, and also quite importantly, do you need offline functionality? Offline functionality is quite a difficult one because it involves a synchronization of data. And generally what you would need is a native application, where native is something that's installed onto the device so that there is a little mini database that captures and manages that data. And then when you are online again, pushes it into a server environment where you can consolidate the data. Most of the guys, well, certainly Honor has that, Magpie has that, Comcast has that, Texit, Kobo has also some offline functionality. The web-based forms have very limited offline functionality. For the most part, you can only store a single submission while you're waiting to reconnect. So again, I think the starting point is to decide whether or not you need offline or online data collection. If you don't need offline data collection, then the easiest point of entry would be a web form using what I would do is I would use a WordPress plugin. We've used a few different ones. There are quite a number of tools that you can use for web-based forms. Otherwise, I would use something like Kobo Connect if you've got some internal capacity to navigate the setup of those forms. If you do have budget, the guys at Comcare have got a really mature product, Magpie as well, really mature. Usually the cost ranges between $20 and $50 a user, depending on the level of package that you opt in for. So yeah, it really depends on the context in which you're collecting that data. Qualitative and quantitative data collection. I'm just going to the question there from Nadine. The qualitative and quantitative, again, that's more about the setup of the form itself, because what you're looking to do is within quantitative data is you're easily able to aggregate that data. Qualitative data, you're going to need to capture either big chunks of text, or you're going to capture video, or you're going to capture audio. And then your analysis is then going to involve some kind of thematic classification in order to distill qualitative data down into quantitative measures, again, depending on what the objectives are for the data. So most tools should manage both quantitative and qualitative data, because it's inevitably required, certainly within the reporting context. So again, I think it just depends on what are you looking to achieve with the data, whether it be qualitative or quantitative. There are secondary tools that you can use from an analysis point of view in terms of that qualitative data. Most of the academics use thematic analysis tools, and increasingly those thematic analysis tools have some AI plugged in, some natural language processing to be able to process at pace. So to be able to extract consistent themes and then to classify and categorize those for easier analysis. For the most part, a lot of that analysis is done manually from a qualitative point of view, but there are some research tools that can be used. Unfortunately, those are generally quite expensive, and in the most part, unless you're in the research field, that's going to have to be done manually. So you want to be able to present that data in a format that is easy to access. When it comes to the visualization of data, certainly quantitative data, things like Power BI and Metabase are a good starting point. Power BI is probably the most accessible and the easiest because there's also a fairly generous free offering that can be accessed through Microsoft. So again, that's just incorporating the quantitative data into visuals that you can more accurately access. There are more advanced tools, things like Tableau and ClickView, which will allow you to do more detailed overlays and interrogation of the data to visualize and then draw intelligence from different data sets, either your own or third parties, and start to slice and dice the data. So for that, you would need something like Power BI or Metabase or Tableau or something like ClickView. The content management function, this generally is one of the drivers of the internet as we know it. So content management would be the likes of WordPress and Drupal and Joomla. This is where we're managing the content that we're distributing through digital format. So we certainly use WordPress a lot. WordPress has taken over quite a bit of market share from Joomla and Drupal. These are all free tools. So provided you've got a server to operate them on, you can deploy WordPress and start building a website. Bring in multiple plugins to manage how your content is displayed, and fairly easily use that software to manage information that you're distributing on an ongoing basis. As I said, the content management systems like WordPress and Drupal and Joomla, there are thousands and thousands of plugins. So plugins are additional tool sets that you can add into your content management system that would allow you to do things like capture data through a form. But there are literally thousands of other plugins that would add the functionality to your content management system, and also could extend it into things like customer relationship management. So customer relationship management is largely understood within the development sector as relating to things like donors and funders. So how do we manage the relationship with our customers? How do we manage the follow-up with them? How do we manage the contact with them? Although it can be used when doing things like household surveys, household visits, where we're looking to track a range of activities against a particular client. So the customer relationship management has a number of different workflow functions that can support the work that we're doing, and also provide a structured process for those workflows and those interactions with customers. In a similar way, the stock management works with also with plugins. You can plug that into your content management system, although you may have a dedicated stock management system that allows you both offline and online function. Sorry, just coming back to some of those questions there. Nadine, data analysis is not necessarily done by a researcher. Certainly, we're all required to do some level of data analysis at some point in time. Again, I think the level of data analysis will vary, and ultimately it depends on the complexity of the data that you're analyzing. Ideally, you want the analysis of the data, certainly at a basic level, to be fairly straightforward. So even if you're doing the visualization of quantitative data, your system should give you a view of that data so that you can quite easily analyze and understand it. In terms of the qualitative data, it doesn't necessarily have to be done by a researcher or somebody that's highly skilled. For the most part, we can all look at a piece of quantitative or qualitative data and look for common themes. So the easiest way to do a thematic analysis is to use a Likert scale. On a scale of 1 to 5, does this response seem happy, sad, indifferent? Where does that response score? So there is some qualitative analysis that you can do without needing a skilled researcher to do that for you. So I hope that answers the question there, Nadine. Case management is something that we're likely to see quite often as well within our context. Case management looking at, for example, social work, where there's some specific workflow that links to the interaction with particular clients or beneficiaries. There are some great free tools that are available. So, for example, that's CPMS and also the GBV IMS. So those are all management systems specifically designed for case management, for things like child protection, and then also gender-based violence. Those are based off of the Primero platform and a generic caseworker platform. All three of those are open source and freely available. Again, the cost comes in navigating those and setting them up. But those three are also a part of the collective UNICEF investment into systems. So UNICEF has been working with those partners and building out some tooling for case management, specifically relating to things like child protection. Then learner management. Certainly anybody that's been working with young people in and around COVID would have had to quickly jump into online learner management systems. So these are systems that allow you to manage online learning. So learner management also used interchangeably with things like e-learning, where you're creating learning content, you're doing things like assessments, you're tracking engagement, you're managing a base of learners, and also managing your content and the engagement with your content. So lots of different learner management systems. The ones in the bottom left-hand corner there, so there's Open edX, there's EdApp and Camilo. These are also open source platforms. Some have free hosted versions as well. Again, different categories of use that can be applied. Coming back to WordPress and also Joomla and Drupal, all three of those content management systems, they do have plugins for learner management. So if you want to set up an online academy, you can get a plugin and install it on your website, and you're pretty much good to go. So lots of tools around learner management systems. Again, you're going to largely get what you pay for. So if you're looking for complex structures around managing different learner journeys on a particular system, those systems are going to cost a lot more. And if we look at what's running off of things like Coursera, they've obviously got bespoke build, but even the edX guys are using Open edX. They've just made their platform available for organizations to use. Sorry, it's coming back to you, Renel. Yes, I'll share the details there of the those child protection. There I was talking about the CP IMS and the GBV IMS. So those are instances running off of the Primero platform. So I'll share those links as part of the presentation as well, so you can access those. But definitely worth a look-see. There's lots of functionality that's been baked in. As we've seen, most of the functionality that we're going to need, regardless of the work that we're doing, is very similar to a lot of other places in the world. So for the most part, there are tools available that we just need to look for and then navigate how to implement them within our organization. So there's definitely something that's been done before. It's just a matter of finding the most suitable one, ideally testing as much as you can beforehand, failing fast if you have to, and finding one that is fit for purpose. Certainly the movement towards online systems is obviously accelerated over the past 10, 15 years, but we are still having to navigate things like offline environments where there is always going to be limited connectivity. So we've recently been looking at things like offline learning hubs and offline content devices. And UNICEF has a project that's been running for quite some time called the Learning Passport. So Learning Passport is looking at both online content, but also they have a device that you can install where there is no connectivity. So I'll also drop in the link for the Learning Passport. You can have a look at what they have to offer on in different countries. South Africa is unfortunately a little bit behind in terms of the deployment on the Learning Passport, and I'm not sure in the status of the devices, but I know that the global team is doing a lot of work around upgrading those devices and making them more available and accessible from a cost point of view. We've used an offline learning hub ourselves that's also coming out of the US. We've gone for a platform, I have one here, which is basically a device that looks a lot like that. So this is basically a learning hub in a box, and what it allows is users to connect digitally to that device without having to be on the internet. So within this device that we use, there's about 500 gigabytes of learning content for all ages. So starting at early childhood development level and going all the way up to adult learning, a bunch of other content, textbooks, TEDx talks, a fairly significant amount of existing content that's been curated specifically for the development sector. There is also a a full learner management system on the device that we use to curate our own courses. So you can also upload content onto the device, much like you can with the Learning Passport device, so that you can also supplement the available libraries of content with your own content as you're deploying specific projects. So most of those devices will allow about 50 concurrent connections. Again, you don't need to be connected to the internet, but you can connect your mobile device directly to the Learning Hub to be able to stream the content when you're in an offline environment. So lots of opportunities to find ways to manage this interim state that I believe we're in, which is limited connectivity in certain areas. It won't last forever. We're likely to see that, certainly that proliferation of connectivity as our friend Mr. Musk pushes out his fleet of satellites. We're going to see those gaps in terms of access to connectivity shrinking quite significantly. Okay. And then as we move on to the more advanced technology functions, this has jumped up since the beginning of this year. So it started in November last year with ChatGPT. It's ramped up enormously from January to now, the growth being exponential in terms of access. I'm sure almost everyone's heard of ChatGPT before. It is certainly the tool of the month when it comes to advanced technologies and improved capabilities around technology. These technologies form the suite of what we would commonly call 4IR, or the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And it is talking about the more advanced technologies that are evolving exponentially at this stage. So off of the back of OpenAI, things like ChatGPT, which allow us to interact in a slightly different way, not with other people, but with systems directly without any direct interference. So things like ChatGPT are causing a lot of concern and a lot of fear in certain areas because of the autonomous nature of the data processing, and plugging in things like OpenAI into your chatbots, where you've got automated responses to conversations using things like WhatsApp or something like Fresh Chat or Talk, where you think you're interacting with somebody else, but it's actually a system at the other end of the line. So AI has evolved that through a natural processing language, which creates a conversational feedback function for asking questions and getting responses based on massive data sets. The natural language processing is really interesting from within our sector, because it does open up more opportunities for addressing problems at scale. So things like being able to present information in a conversational format, not just accessing big data from the internet, but also accessing specifically curated data sets that can be a first source of reference before we go to the internet. So AI does give us those opportunities to more rapidly reply and respond to questions about whatever it is that we're doing. And certainly the ease of interacting is one of the key features of that conversational AI capability within ChatGPT. Linked to that are things like machine learning. So this is where the machine or the system itself is learning through trial and error around what is correct and what is incorrect. The best example of this would be, for example, classifying images. So through machine learning, we can train a system to recognize different images. And that's being used extensively on things like self-driving cars. So machine learning is helping the car to navigate through the road, and also to learn what is what is something to be careful of and what is something that we can happily accelerate towards. But there are a lot of different applications from a machine learning point of view when it comes to both imaged and traditional system functions in either text or in data. The applications are slow to flow down into our sector, although we are seeing more organizations using it when it comes to the classification of healthcare conditions. It's a big driver in, for example, being able to do immediate diagnosis based on a cough. So you do have applications that can give you a preliminary diagnosis based on the sound of your cough, based on a few hundred million different coughs that have been analyzed. So there are great opportunities for things like machine learning to support the sort of development outcomes that we're looking to realize. Linked to that, drone technology. Organizations that are working in remote areas, drones can provide great access and visibility, in particular organizations that are working in the WASH environment. So if you're looking at mapping out water sources and sanitation and even broader topography, things like drones can help to support that. Most of that drone function, you have automated robotic devices, either drones that are flying or drones that are moving on land, capturing images and data, and then sending that back for processing so that you can either analyze or you can automatically deduce based on that image where a particular data set is relevant. So some really interesting work happening around drone technology, in particular where we've got disconnected communities to be able to do things like deliver vaccines. So that's a good example of where drones have been used effectively. Blockchain and digital identity and verified credentials. Blockchain, really a secure distributed storage mechanism. The best example of that, of course, being things like Bitcoin, where you've got a distributed ledger of value that's shared out and secured across a distributed network, so it can't be copied or duplicated or broken into or stolen. Lots of work now currently within pretty much every country around things like digital identity. Good and bad in that. And I think the same with all of these technologies, including things like biometrics. I'm not sure if the team from Remote Harbor is here, but there's some great work happening around making biometric functionality available in disconnected or remote areas to verify identity and leverage that more effectively to deliver service. But I think things like the digital identity and blockchain and AI, there are areas of concern. And I think just in closing out this conversation around the evolving technologies, something that we certainly need to be aware of within the development sector. There is massive opportunity for abuse of these technologies. We have seen it in Africa and other low-income countries where there are particular parties that are harvesting identities. And you may or may not have seen some of this in the media. There are companies that will go into the community, they'll pay people to register, they'll capture their full biometric suite, their retina scan, their fingerprints, and in some cases, even their biorhythms. So within those low-income countries, there's less concern about giving that data away. And if you're incentivized with a little bit of money, a lot of people are happy to simply give their data away. The question, of course, being what's going to happen with that data. And as we're seeing governments using digital identities and moving away from levels of individual control of identity, there are some warning signs, some red flags for us to be aware of in terms of the potential for the misuse of personal data. So when we're looking at digitizing data, digitizing records, and digitizing identity, our key role is to be custodians of that data and ensure that it's not going to be abused or even politicized down the line. So it is important that that data is kept secure and safe. So I'm just aware of time. So I've been waxing lyrical in some of these areas. So I just want to move on. So as we move away from off the shelf, the next level up is things like no code or system assembly. Again, there are a whole range of no code tool sets. So no code basically means that I don't need to write the software code in order to build a system. I can assemble it with some pre-configured blocks. So I can basically drag and drop and create a mobile application. I can create a web application and very easily build and deploy a software tool without having any coding language whatsoever. This is really interesting for me personally, because I think it's a great opportunity for young people certainly within the African context, where we're still trying to chase to catch up to software development and data science. Personally, I think that ship has sailed. It's already arrived in India and Eastern Europe and Brazil. And yeah, we've largely missed the boat. But because the technology's evolved so quickly, we can start to build applications without any software development knowledge. So we don't have to learn the language. We can use the tools and achieve the same outcome faster and with much less skill required. So within the space of 3 months, I can learn how to use one of these tool sets so that I can start to monetize that capability very, very quickly in building a tool for data capture and building a tool for workflow management. And all of these platforms offer that capability. Most part, it's relatively low cost. A lot of them have free offerings, again, up to a point, but it means that you can build an entire application end to end in a couple of weeks. So there is a lot of opportunity within this no-code arena for really rapid iteration of technology tools and solutions. And as I said, a great opportunity for young people that are looking to enter into the digital economy. They don't have the resources to study software development for 3 years, but can learn how to use the platform and then rapidly build out tools for small businesses, for organizations, even for corporates. So corporates use a lot of these tools if they're looking at minimum viable products, something they want to iterate quickly. So no code, really some great opportunity there. And then we have my old friend, the custom development environment. So custom software development is tough. Custom software development is tough. I always like to describe it as an arranged marriage. It needs lots of patience and lots of compromise, and certainly 2 people involved in the relationship. And if you think about it as a marriage, you have 2 parties that are brought together around an objective, and immediately they have this baby, which is the system, needs lots of support. There's lots of sleepless hours. There's lots of inevitably screaming and shouting and misunderstanding because the parents are tired and have been working hard at it. And the baby is needing the support on an ongoing basis. Certainly as it grows, it's going to keep falling over. You need to keep picking it up and carrying it forward. You need to provide an environment that's safe for it. You need to make sure it's secure. You need to make sure that it's housed properly, that it's sustained and has all of the right care structures around it. As it matures and gets older, it needs perhaps less focus and attention, but certainly it's going to be difficult in different ways. And again, it's going to need that fairly consistent support. And hopefully it gets to a point where the system becomes this mature adult where it doesn't need as much attention, but inevitably when things go wrong, the parents are still going to have to get involved to solve those problems. And then ultimately, the system is going to reach this stage of nearing an end of life. And as you enter that stage, is the system going to need some major overhauls? Do I need a hip replacement for my enterprise system? Or do I need to turn it off? Is it reached its end of life? And do we need to retire the system? So it is any kind of custom development is a long-term relationship and one that has lots of complexity to it. So certainly not undertaken for the light of heart, or it's not a light undertaking. Certainly lots of resources required. In terms of that life cycle, generally running through some function of prototyping that gives you a first iteration that will give you a view of what's going to be developed. Important to buffer the cost expectations and timelines. Done is never done. It's always a first iteration that has to be improved and enhanced. And if you can, prepare for divorce in advance. Make sure there are lots of notes and there's prep for handover so that if you are going to get divorced and bring another party into the relationship, you can manage that with as little pain as possible. And then also consider things like third-party licenses and services that your system may be dependent on. Deployment, as you're deploying those systems, lots of testing. It's not just the developer that's going to have to test. You as an organization are going to have to do a lot of testing to make sure that it's not falling down. The developer's never going to catch all of the bugs. You need to be there to test and spend the time to ensure that the product you're getting is going to be as good as possible. Things to think about also the hosting accounts and the cloud services where the application is going to live. Who owns the domain registration? Are there security certificates in place? And then also, have you done the registration for the various app stores? Again, you want to make sure that you have as much control on that as possible so that you can also manage things like divorce. Adoption we've spoken about. Consider the context, get buy-in early, if you can. Always put the user at the center of any build cycle, making sure that it's as easy to use and the value can be seen as quickly as possible. And then invest in the warmware layer, because that's really what's going to drive the adoption and use of any system that you deploy. The maintenance component is certainly one that is forgotten. So once your system is deployed and it's alive and well and everyone is using it, it's going to carry ongoing cost and going to need ongoing support. So even as we hit those teen years and those adulting years, you still need to maintain the environment. You need to maintain the code base, and you're going to need to fix bugs. You're going to need to update various frameworks. You're going to need to do preventative maintenance so that the system keeps managing the data as it should be. So cleaning out and archiving big data sets, all of those functions of any kind of maintenance process. Making sure that you're allocating enough revenue or funding for the hosting costs, and certainly allocating some funding towards the iteration of your first release. There are going to be rolling costs related to that system, regardless of how well it's developed and how well you're in step with your developer. Of course, security, a big concern, making sure that you have firewalls in place and also you have necessary redundancy. So things like backup. So what happens if things go wrong? What is the process for restoring the system? How do I get the data back? How do I turn it back on again if it's fallen down? So again, having regular backups and restore capabilities are important as part of that maintenance consideration. Good. So I think that brings us to the end of the most of the fun stuff. I have rushed through a bit of the custom development lifecycle, but I think just to say that it is something that is not for the faint of heart, and definitely needs to be planned for as best you can well in advance. And that does link into probably the least favorite part of the conversation, which is governance, which is all of the policy stuff that nobody ever thinks about or doesn't like to think about. All of the paperwork that you need in terms of ensuring the system security, the data protection, the redundancy, things like user access, and also the management of your relationship with any vendors before we even start looking at the legislative compliance. So that legislative compliance there, we're talking primarily about the things like POPIA, but security, your system security, who has access to it, who can do what with what parts of the system, how is that managed? Do you have firewalls in place to prevent nefarious actors from accessing your system? Are you managing different access points from different countries? How are you managing that, the integrity of your system? And that links into your data protection, whether it's those nefarious actors or your internal users. How are you protecting the data? And then also making sure that it is always available and backed up. Part of that will be carried by your vendor, which you need to then manage through some form of SLA. But also it is an internal process that also needs to have policies in place to manage the kind of the security and governance of the system once it's operating. The legislative compliance one, here we're talking about POPIA and GDPR as you extend outside of South Africa. This is going to get interesting over the next few years. The legislator is only now starting to flex their muscle. They do have a range of options when it comes to enforcement. Fortunately, within the NGO sector, we're less of a target because we don't have any money to recover fines from. But certainly the regulator is going to start looking at all sectors. And as an example, they've recently issued a fine, I think it was R500,000 or more, to the Department of Justice for breach of PAPIA. Interestingly, the Department of Justice is the department that holds the regulator. So the regulator falls under the Department of Justice, and I think it's really just an example of them flexing and showing that if they're willing to go after their own, they're certainly willing to go after corporate entities. And I don't know how long they'll wait before they start looking at other entities like the NGO sector. So managing personal information is going to be a more and more important area of the governance within any organization. These steps that I put up here and on the screen are drawn from our friends at DSD. We were recently at a workshop with them and Stats SA looking at integrated indicators and how that is going to be applied across the national context, but also aligning with things like the SDGs. PAPIA, there are a range of guidelines and frameworks to consider. But it is something that needs to be part of a broader governance process around the management of your data. And I'm happy to share a few links of other services that can be accessed. There's packages to manage things like how you set up your information officer, how you define your processes, defining your user sets. But it is something that needs ongoing and fairly consistent focus for any organization that's working with individual data. So I think definitely should be a priority for organizations. We will speak to the UNICEF team about scheduling hopefully a PAPIA session where we can run through some of the intricacies of navigating this issue of protecting personal information. And with that, I think we're largely at an end of the session. It has been a fairly busy presentation, and unfortunately I've had to rush through some of the sections. But certainly, as I said, welcome to send me through any follow-up questions that you might have. There's my email address in the bottom right corner. The approach to technology is fairly layered. There are lots of considerations around the use and adoption of technology, as we've kind of tried to highlight in the session. Give some thought to, in particular, that warmware layer. The people are, at the end of the day, the most important part of any system deployment, in my opinion. So it's important that you consider them at the start of any technology journey, at all stages during the journey, and then certainly as you're deploying that technology, to consider the support layers that you have in place to drive adoption and use. And of course, Google is your friend when it comes to looking at what options you might have available. So go to Google as a starting point, look for things that are already in existence, access what you can, try not to rebuild, speak to your peers, your colleagues, find out who else has built some technology. Can you access it? Can you reuse it? Ideally, we should be spending our money on improving and enhancing technologies, not reinventing or rebuilding them. But it does start with a conversation to find out what is available, check online, speak to the people that you know, speak to your colleagues, and find a solution ideally that can give you the capabilities that you need at a relatively low cost, and iterate. The first deployment of any technology is just that. It's just the first step. So you're likely to have multiple steps, multiple iterations. Done is never done, no matter what a developer tells you. There's always bugs, there's always enhancements, there's always changes. So it is always an evolving process, especially when it comes to custom development. But definitely across the board in driving adoption and usage, it's a gradual ongoing process. So I'm going to stop there about 2 minutes before the end of the time. and just ask if there are any questions, if you have any comments. As I said, if you do have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out and drop me a mail. I'm happy to give you some input and also share any links and additional documentation. Thanks, Ava. Let's just find. I thought I saw a hand. If there are any hands or any questions, you can drop them in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute. And no questions. Well, thanks everyone for your time today. I've made everything up. It's all a made-up story. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's added some value. As I said, we will look to run some follow-up sessions to expand on some of the different areas that we've been talking about, so that there's some more in-depth breakdown that we can do within particular areas of focus. Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone. As I said, if there are any other questions, just feel free to drop them in the chat or drop me an email, and we'll share the presentation and then also the recording for the session. Okay, thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week. I think we're over the hump, so on the downhill to the weekend. But yeah, thanks everyone for your team. Thank you.